All right. So let me go ahead and go through this bit here for what's coming up. So this week, your numbers survey was due. So again, just a heads up, your numbers survey is due. If you haven't gotten on that, please turn it in as soon as possible. Again, the survey is included within the actual assignment itself. So again, if you haven't gotten on that, please do turn it in. There is quite a bit of people that haven't turned it in. Some people have asked me about late assignments. Yes, you can turn them in. Second, if there are assignments you don't want to miss or you don't want to not turn in, this is one of them. Um, Simply because we don't have a lot of them, they take up a good chunk of your grade. The other thing is that even with the quizzes, if you haven't taken the quiz yet, please let me know which one you haven't taken yet, because those will come out of zeros and weigh your grade down terribly. So especially as we're getting to this last stretch of the course, if you're looking over your grade, you're getting a little nervous, you're getting anxious, you're wondering like, oh shoot, like, am I going to be able to pass or at least get a good grade, whether it be for financial reasons or you just expectations you have set for yourself. Do look it over, and if there's any holes that you're seeing, please let me know where you're seeing it, and know that you have the opportunity to turn in your late work and take quizzes. So again, you can get away with missing a worksheet or two, but those surveys, that's going to be hard. It's going to be really difficult. So if you're going to focus anywhere, focus on these surveys. So just a word to the wise. Heads up for next week. There is a worksheet, even though it says complete worksheet number 9, but the date's right. The worksheet number is not. Worksheet number 13, you'll notice not overly difficult, and the reading quiz as well. So you will have, again, as I stated before, you have all week to get it done, take it as many times as you need to. If you want to just give it a shot, see how you do the first time around, and then knock it out next time. In a few days, as you're working on the worksheet, please do notice your reading there as well. Do for next week, and in a couple weeks, Deuteronomy survey again here. So again, just to keep this in mind as you're working through, plan out your week. But yeah, there's not a ton of stuff going on, so that should at least be somewhat helpful to note for again next week, and then the week after that. I don't have anything up yet. You'll notice if you've gone to week 15, worksheet number 14 is extra credit. You can complete that before the last day of finals week. So the Friday of finals week, as long as you get it in before then, that thing's extra credit. So again, if you're nervous, you hadn't finished one of these worksheets back here and want to just knock one out, it's really easy if you take a look through it. And again, I'll be posting the study guide here this week for you to take a look at, and we'll walk through it in the coming weeks. So just a heads up for that. Any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, fears, insecurities, regrets? Last minute reconsiderations for the poll. Any names you want to throw out there to nominate? Who's gonna lead the charge against these aliens? All right. All right. If John Wick were a real human being, I would say him. Look all he did for just a puppy. So, let alone an entire planet. All right. So let's go ahead, get in a lecture for this afternoon. So a couple things, what we're going to go through today. One of them is going to review last class like we usually do. In talking about the section between numbers 11 to 14, and then over in chapter 20, and then how numbers ends, because how numbers ends will bring up a lot of issues that will be addressed in Deuteronomy, the book as a whole. And if we don't understand how numbers ends, and especially the troubling situation Israel is in the thick of numbers, then Deuteronomy is going to lose its context, and we're going to miss a lot of what's going on there, which is not only very important, but also gets built on as the monarchy starts developing and then the people start settling in the land here, especially when you take kings and prophets. Deuteronomy, I'll say this. It's because of Deuteronomy's importance that we really need to understand the ways in which numbers ends and the inflammation that surrounds the situation in numbers. specifically in the middle chapters. We talked last class with belief and trust being two sides of the same coin, and talking about these instances of complaining in Numbers 11, 12, 13, 14, and then 20. These instances of complaining about water, complaining about food, how the people are given over not just to mistrust of Yahweh's power, but ultimately of rebellion, of looking for a king who's going to replace Yahweh because he's not able to provide for his people in the middle of the wilderness. And I talked about, and you may or may not see this in a quiz coming up as a heads up, how the wilderness represents this place of testing, but also a place where God gathers his people and is with his people. So again, this place of testing, a place where God is with his people. And that it's in this place where the testing of the people's loyalty, their devotion, their trust, their faith, if we want to put it that way, is tested. And that's, again, both prefiguring what Jesus does later in the gospel, but then also teaches us something about the nature of what it means to be a follower of Yahweh, to be a part of God's people, and the understanding between God's commands to obedience and what faith looks like. Having faith, demonstrating trust, a kind of confidence. You cannot truly believe without this kind of demonstrative trust that is this outward obedience. Again, a Jewish rabbi will come some thousands of years later and say, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. But there's this link between loyalty and keeping one's word. And so just, again, the link there, and we'll talk about it even more so when we get to Deuteronomy. But again, it's here that Deuteronomy necessarily needs this conversation in Numbers, where there's this disconnect in saying, I'm a part of Yahweh's people, but yet I don't do what Yahweh says. So, and we'll talk about that. So again, what Moses does is ends up acting on his own volition. Again, talking to the rock, or talking to the people instead of talking to the rock, and instead striking the rock, and then that ends up getting him kicked out of the promised land. But what I do want to bring up to your attention as we kind of re-rehearse some of this stuff is that what we see with those, again, that rebellion on repeat, it happening over and over again, starting from the people going and infiltrating down with the leadership, or if you want to say infiltrating up to the leadership, however you want to say it. Fungus grows both ways. And so every group among the Israelites there in chapter 11 rebels at God's provision and his plan. Again, in chapter 12, Miriam and Aaron, challenge of Moses, which again is a challenge against Yahweh, reflective of that. And in chapter 13, you have that those who are yearning for the luxuries of Egypt, Egyptian slavery, die in the desert. And then this last break in Numbers 14 of this negative report that just it breaks the will of the people. And I've talked about this before. I talked about this last week, but I do want to re-rehearse it because you will see it on your quiz next week. Is what's the reason why the Hebrews wander for 40 years in the wilderness? There's a specific reason why. And it's not just disobedience is a part of it. But what's the more specific reason than that? Why 40?
For each day the spies
Mm-hmm.
gave a bad report or complained, if I'm not
Attaboy.
mistaken.
Attaboy. For every day the spies brought back a negative report that discouraged the obedience of the people, they got a year for it. So again, the link is between those who are yearning for Egypt and then the negative reports. 40 years, 40 days of negative reports. That again, And it's not just the negative reports, the negative reports that end up discouraging the people from entering into the promised land, doing the very thing that Yahweh had told them to do. So it's both and. That yes, it's disobedience, but it's also these negative reports specifically linked that encourage the disobedience. So again, it's the negative reports that we're looking for. 40 days of negative reports that discourage Israelite obedience. 40 days of negative reports that it discourage the obedience of the Israelites or the Hebrews. And again, you're going to see that in the quiz coming up. And so the second act, because you did not believe in me, that you have this problem found in this comparison between Yahweh's instructions and what Moses does and the people end up doing. And that we find here specifically in Numbers 20, as we talked about last week, almost at the point of ad nauseum, but that it's not because Moses doesn't know or doesn't understand, but rather that he doesn't do it. It's not that the people don't know, but just choose not to do it. And so, again, the link here between obedience and loyalty, and the demonstration that one necessarily needs the other to prove as the kind of follow through. It's not just the point of the declaration, but then also the demonstration of the trust that is being confessed, the follow through, the obedience. Once again, and so again, that their unbelief, it's not just their inability, but rather an active swerving from the path that Yahweh has for them. And we talked about in Leviticus with the various definitions for sin, that one of them is swerving from Yahweh's good path. And that's what Torah is. Again, this instruction into Yahweh's teaching in the way that they ought to go. The Yahweh who brings them out into the wilderness, makes provisions for them in the wilderness. At the same time, it's the decision of the Hebrews, the Israelites, if you want to call it, to again continually swerve. And in some ways, the swerving is literal. We want to go back. We want to turn our feet around, go back the opposite direction. This ain't comfortable. We had it easy in Egypt. Cucumbers, melons, onions, leeks. It was great. We ate however we wanted, but yet again, forgetting the bitterness of oppression in Egypt. And so again, this middle period, this middle phase was enough to cause the Hebrews to shudder from entering into the promised land. And it's not just something it's just, again, they deal with, but something we also deal with as well today, whether it be in spiritual terms or very physical terms. How often this is myself included, so I'm going to be preaching to myself here, and it's only because the Lord impressed it on my brain. So how often we're tempted to give up at the slightest sign of difficulty. How often we're tempted to give in to mistrust or not proceed with what the Lord would want us to do, because the appearance that, man, ain't nothing out here for me. Why? What's the point? Why would I keep doing that? It's pointless. Ain't nothing out here. And so again, the temptation in places like that is to give up. Is to give up, despite the fact that, again, God's with us. He's given us a spirit. Part of you being in God's family, that's what that means. And knowing that if the Lord's taking you to a place, he's not going to fail in getting you there, even though it looks like you made a wrong left turn somewhere. And for some of y'all ending up at this little school in San Dimas doing online coursework, feeling like you're just throwing stuff at the wall, trying to figure things out. A lot of y'all in the same spot, trying to just figure it out. What's the point? Almost the end of the semester. What's the point? But again, the particular thing about it is that, one, God is in places like that. He draws people to his places like that. So you're the very fact of your existence, not just in this class, but you're going through this season at LPU isn't by accident. God is here directing your path. So if you're wondering where God's at, He's right here, even if you don't necessarily fully sense and feel that. And the other thing is that going through the wilderness was a necessary endeavor for the people to get into the promised land. That for them to get to the point C, like A to C, they had to go through B. And so whatever it is that you're going through right now and feeling a lot like what in the world is the point right now, just feeling like giving up, it may be perhaps because this is the necessary part of the journey that's going to get you from point A to point C, the next place where the Lord's wanting you to go. Even if it doesn't make sense, and I would dare to say, especially because it doesn't make no sense. And we're not going to know until afterwards. Because a lot of times, I've told you guys this before, and I'll tell you guys again, partly because I'm going to need this reminder for myself as well. A lot of our theology is done in retrospect, looking back. The ways in which we understand God at work in our lives is through looking back. That you can kind of see how things were set up, and maybe some things were a disappointment and a letdown, but then other things happen because of that. And I'm not going to say everything happens for a reason, because there's some things that just can't be explained, like when suffering and evil happen. But I will say that if you know the Lord's led you somewhere, especially again when you know, like, well, the Lord's provided and He's guiding here, even though it's difficult, that there will be more regret in giving up, wondering what could have happened, knowing that the Lord had guided you to a certain place, than trying to stick it out and giving it your best. And I'm not trying to necessarily say this to hope to improve retention numbers as much as it is in looking back on my own life up to this point, and again, being in places where it's like being up at 2 or 3 in the morning. What in the world is the point of doing all this dang homework when I don't even know if I'm gonna have a job after this? Having no prospects at the time. And mind you, your boy was single for like 10 years, so I couldn't even have a distraction for me to like, well, I'll figure it out later. I'll figure it out later. And then now looking back in retrospect, seeing the decisions and the way it's made, it's absolutely been worth it. Difficult. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Still proves to be difficult. Worth it? Definitely. Definitely. So I see all that to say, don't give up. Don't give up, especially at this point in the semester. That's that question will come up. What's the point? What's the point? What's the point? But again, I want to remind you not only of the recognition of the Lord calling you guys to not just be here, but to go through this process of the Lord making you something that you would not otherwise be without this process of being more concerned with the ways in which you're being shaped more so than just the results that you're able to produce. And yeah, those results will come, but it's only because of the process of refining that you are undergoing the shaping of what God is wanting to do in you through this process. And that maybe Israel would have been allowed into the promised land should they have given themselves over to the process of going through the wilderness. But because they refused, they were prohibited from entering into the promised land. Again, not just because of disobedience, but rebellion. An active now. No, I want to go back to Egypt where we had it good. We were better off over there. Again, allowing ourselves to go through this process that we might become something that we might not otherwise be without this necessary process. And I'm not going to generalize it for everybody, saying like all of you need to go through whatever it is you're going through. If you're in abusive situations, that's not good, and that's not God's will. Reconciliation, sure, but again, for you to suffer in under abuse when it's needless, then obviously that's not good. But um, again, specifically with the responsibilities that you have, that you know the Lord's guiding you through, to continue through the process, it's difficult. It's difficult, and that's why we as a community need each other, to support one another. And the existence for office hours and why I keep saying you guys need anything, let me know, let me know, let me know. And just like again, the persistence in showing grace, because I know it's difficult, especially right now. So that being said, again, that bit in Numbers to will set up, especially for us as readers, what we're going to be seeing in Deuteronomy for the second generation. That's going to be marked by a kind of hope, and I'll get there in a little bit because of what's happening here in Numbers. But here at the end of Numbers 21, to get back to the text here in Numbers 21, what we have is that the people go on to defeat some of the groups of the Canaanites and then complain how there's no water and the food sucks, how miserable they are. So again, experiencing this kind of radical provision in these group of wanderers in the middle of the wilderness, just kind of migrating in place, that aren't prepared for battle, yet experiencing victory in war, then go off and complain. Ain't no water, and this food tastes like garbage. So again, just these radical contrasts that mark so much of Numbers between the demonstration of radical provision, but yet I would dare to say this kind of radical rebellion that comes into conflict with these demonstrations. And again, it doesn't just mark them, it marks us as well. And so just a little bit of encouragement there. All right. So as we close out Numbers, I do want to read a little bit of this, and then we'll dig into this story that you guys all have read for today. Anybody want to read this? I've been talking a lot already, and it's only 2:15 almost. Anybody want to read this?
I'll go ahead and read it.
Do it, man.
The Israelites set out and camped in the plains of Moab across the Jordan from Jericho. Now Balak, son of Zippor, saw all that Israel had done to the Amorites. Moab was in great dread of the people because they were so numerous. Moab was overcome with the fear of the people of Israel. And Moab said to the elders of Midian, "This horde will now lick up all that is around us, as an ox licks up the grass of the field." Now Balak, son of
Balak.
Zippor, Balak?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Son of Zippor was king of Moab at that time. He sent messengers to Balaam, son of Beor, at Pethor, which is on the Euphrates and in the land of Ammah, to summon him, saying, "A people has come out of Egypt. They have spread over the face of the earth, and they have settled next to me. Come now, curse this people for me, since they are stronger than I. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them from the land. For I know that whomever you bless is blessed, and whomever you curse is cursed."
Sweet. Thank you, Jasper. Good. So we have this introduction to two characters as we're finishing out Numbers, one of them being Balak, who's looking over all that is happening in this territory. Again, as Israel is moving from the wilderness, kind of going more towards Canaan, you have this movement happening, and they're seeing what's being done, again done to the Amorites. So Balak, being head of the Moabites, seeing the people of Israel approaching, will then approach his own elders and then enlist, essentially. He's sometimes dubbed either what would be called a seer or ends up becoming a prophet. And I'll talk about why that's ironic. But again, the desire is for Balak or for Balaam to perform a kind of cultic ritual magic in order to curse the people. And so if you want to think about it this way, it's kind of like an incantation, if you will, to prohibit the people from taking over the Moabites. And so you have this section starting out specifically in Numbers 22 to 24 is Balaam and his talking donkey, that you have Balak, who's king of Moab, or chief of Moab, rather, and then Balaam, who's this traveling prophet or seer for hire. And you guys will have read for today in these stories that Balaam comes with a cost. And again, as being of, I don't want to compare him to a televangelist, but there is some components that can be compared. It'd probably be best put kind of like how you see, I don't want to say Walter Mercado, but anybody remember Miss Cleo? No. All right. Kind of like how sometimes you'll see like there's sidekicks on TV and you pay a certain amount and they'll read your hands, they'll know your future, they'll roll the dice, look into a little ball and tell you what the future's about. It's a little bit like that, where they want Balaam to harness some kind of divine power in order to inflict a kind of curse upon Israel to prohibit their encroachment into the land. But what these series of poems, that's exactly what they are, what these series of poems will describe is God's blessing upon Israel, even in light of her rebellion. And that point I cannot overstate. This section, if you get nothing else other than the fact that this donkey talks, and if God can talk through a donkey, he can talk through anybody, which again, that's the good news and the bad news. That just because you talk for God doesn't mean that that God's told you to talk. Are you talking about Para de Sufrir? Kind of. It's super similar. Where essentially you hire somebody to harness some kind of spiritual divine power for your benefit. But what we see happen specific in this story and on these occasions, the name sounds familiar. That's why. Oh yeah. Walter Mercado. He's huge. But especially with what's happening here, in light of what we just read last week and at the start of this class, in Numbers 11 through 14, and again with 20, how we see this radical rebellion. What's happening here in Numbers 22 to 24, that what seems to be a fitting punishment of how God feels about Israel, having rebelled these 4 to 5 times, that we would think that judgment and punishment is now, that's got to be the last word. They've rebelled, that's it. Anybody coming to talk smack, God's left them vulnerable. Why? Because you can't be a rebel and both have God's blessing still. You can't have separated yourself from God and still have some kind of part to do with God and still have some kind of blessing. But yet what we find here specific in Numbers 22 to 24 is exactly that. So you have Balak who builds these 7 altars and sacrifices a bull and a ram. Again, this kind of over and above kind of sacrificial offering to appease the deities. Again, to bribe the deities and give Balak the curse on Israel that the king, who's Balak, desires. Again, this kind of bribery that makes sense. Because guess who else asked for a bull and a ram? Who else is pleased by sacrificial offerings?
God.
There you go, Yahweh. So again, this kind of attempt to appease the deity, but when Balaam goes to consult with God, God goes, he puts a word in Balaam's mouth and instructs him on what he ought to say in the first 2 scenes, and then we see this kind of third poem that comes from Balaam, but then also from God as well. And so Balaam, who works as this kind of outside prophet for hire, that is not a Hebrew, he's not an Israelite. who functions as this mouthpiece of God's blessing upon Israel, even after their rebellion in the wilderness. That this prophet functions as a mouthpiece of God's blessing even after rebellion. God's commitment to his people demonstrated in this kind of 3 to 4-fold blessing given to Israel, the demonstration of God's covenant commitment to his people. We saw it in Genesis 3. We saw it in Genesis 4. We saw it in Genesis 6. We saw it happen in the Exodus in Exodus 2 and 3. We saw it after the Exodus in Exodus 18 and 19. And here we are seeing, and we saw it again after Exodus 32. And then we see it here again in Numbers 22 to 24, God's covenant commitment to his people, this demonstration that God is not relenting in his commitment to bring Israel into the land. And so I do need to bring up a point with this talking donkey, because it does appear to be quite a weird situation. And so you will have read that in this specific episode of the talking donkey, let me go ahead and go there. I don't know why I didn't include it, but I'll go ahead and go there so we can see what's going on. Here we go. Okay, Numbers 22. Okay, so Numbers 22. So God's anger was kindled because he was going, this is Balaam. And the angel of the Lord took his stand in the road as his adversary. Fun fact, this word adversary appears as Satan. Again, this is why when we talk about where the devil is and isn't in the Bible, we have to talk with some kind of nuance, because again, adversary in the Old Testament is not a proper name, but rather a title or a function. And here Yahweh acts as a Satan to Balaam, an adversary, an opponent, one who works against another. And so, again, it's not to say that God is Satan or Yahweh is Satan. That's not what I'm saying. But again, using and respecting the Hebrew, this is why we have to give some nuance. But again, that's just more of a side fact. Fun facts. So now he was riding on the donkey. This is Balaam, and his two servants were with him. And the donkey saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with the drawn sword in his hand. So the donkey turned off the road and went into the field, and Balaam struck the donkey to turn it back on the road. Then the angel stood in a narrow path between the vineyards with a wall on either side. Excuse me. When the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it scraped against the wall, and Balaam's foot scraped against the wall, so he struck it again. Then the angel of the Lord went ahead and stood in a narrow place where there was no way to turn either to the right or to the left. And when the donkey saw the angel of the Lord, it lay down under Balaam. And Balaam's anger was kindled, and he struck the donkey with his staff. Then the Lord opened the mouth of the donkey, and it said to Balaam, "What have I done to you that you have struck me these 3 times?" Balaam said to the donkey, "Because you have made a fool of me, I wish I had sword in my hand, I would kill you right now." But the donkey said to Balaam, Am I not your donkey which you have ridden all your life to this day? Have I been in the habit of treating you this way? Then he said, No. Then the Lord opened the eyes of Balaam, and he saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with his drawn sword in his hand, and he bowed down, falling on his face. Then the angel of the Lord said to him, Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? I have come out as an adversary, Satan, because your way is perverse before me. The donkey saw me and turned away from these 3 times. It had not turned away from me. Surely just now I would have killed you and let it live. Then Balaam said to the angel of the Lord, I have sinned, for I did not know that you were standing in the road opposed to me. Notice who does and who doesn't see this angel. This prophet or this seer who's supposed to have some kind of divine intuition, divine insight into all manner of spiritual sorcery things, spiritual things, but yet doesn't see this angel standing before him. So note again within this story some of the irony that's there. Now, therefore, if it is displeasing to you, I will return home. The angel of the Lord said to Balaam, go with the men, but only speak what I tell you to speak. So Balaam went with the officials of Balak, and then the story will continue to go on there. And then that's the rest of the story of Balaam blessing the people, which we'll get into right now. But the reason why I bring that up specifically is, again, this continued demonstration of Yahweh's power being demonstrated on behalf of Israel, protecting Israel, serving Israel, loving Israel, despite the fact that she's rebelled against Yahweh. And that in the midst of this, how this person, Balaam, again, this kind of outsider who was meant to serve as a kind of opponent to Israel, to curse Israel, and how Yahweh, even in the midst of rebellion, comes to Israel's aid and to demonstrate not only his own power, but also to demonstrate a kind of wisdom that undermines powers that would oppose God's people. Again, even in the midst of Israel rebellion, of how Yahweh demonstrates a kind of subversive power that works to protect his people, even when it seems like they ought to be most vulnerable. And so again, there's something to be said about the kind of irony that is demonstrated by those who are perceived to be in power, but actually do not have the power to wield it. Or when Yahweh disarms the powers and principalities, if you will. And so I won't go too far with it, but again, I did want to bring that up in the story, but again, specifically with the donkey incident, that beyond just a donkey talking, the demonstration of both Yahweh's commitment to his people despite the rebellion, and also Yahweh's power to undermine or thwart even those who are considered some of the most powerful, or those with certain prowesses that would leave Israel either vulnerable or to prey upon Israel in her weakness, and those kinds of things. Any questions, comments about that? Because again, I know it's a little bit of a different story, and it's kind of weird to read that story. I'm still thrown off by the part. I was doing research on it again last night, and I realized how much of a headache it gives me. At one point, Yahweh tells Balaam, "Go ahead and go," and in verse 22, he gets mad that he goes. I don't know what to do with that. There's no, and I've done research and there's no explanation of it, other than it's just a combination of stories, and that's where we start to see part of the seams in the way the story's been combined. And Vanessa, you're shaking your head, yelling yes at the muted computer. Why?
I was actually going to talk to you about that because I was really puzzled.
Yeah. I don't know what to do with that part. And everything I'm reading is just saying it's an editing thing. That eventually at some point something had happened where Yahweh grew upset with Balaam, likely because he's being motivated by money, which is why he's on his way down. Because mind you, he doesn't go down until he ups the price, till Balak ups the price. And then finally, when Balak's like, okay, well, tell him I'm going to give him whatever he wants. Or he raises like the gold and the silver, the price that he's going to give to him. And he's like, okay, now I'll go down. Instead of just going down because Yahweh told him to go. So there does seem to be some kind of connection between like Balaam's motivations. And so that's the only distant connection that we kind of have, is that the motivation towards obedience is motivated by money more so rather than like because Yahweh told him to do it. And so, yeah, but outside of that distinct connection, I'm not sure what to do with it, other than, again, the signs of editing there. But it's a tricky story. It's a tricky story. But even with some of the complications, that what we can take from the story is this demonstration of commitment, of desperate commitment from Yahweh towards his people, even after rebellion. That's been consistent. And as I brought up with the passages, Genesis 3, Genesis 4, Genesis 6, Genesis, even after Abraham and Jacob, what's been going on with Exodus 32. And then here again, that reoccurrence of God's covenant faithfulness to his people, and that demonstration that even after rebellion, God's love continues to persist. And so I do want to read this from Numbers 23 and point out a couple things, because it will give us a kind of case in point of what I think we need to, again, be reminded of, especially as we move into Deuteronomy. Then Balaam uttered his oracle, saying, "Rise, Balak, and hear. Listen to me, O son of Zippor. God is not a human being that he should lie, or a mortal that he should change his mind. Has he promised, and will he not do it? Has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? See, I received a command to bless. He is blessed, and I will not revoke it. He has not beheld misfortune in Jacob, nor has he seen trouble in Israel. The Lord their God is with them, acclaimed as king among them. God who brings them up out of Egypt is like the horns of a wild ox for them." Again, this kind of demonstration of power here, which is why the reference to an ox. "Surely there is no enchantment against them, against Jacob, no divination against Israel. Now it shall be said of Jacob and Israel, see what God has done. Look, a people rising up like a lioness and rousing itself like a lion. It does not lie down until it has eaten the prey and drunk the blood of the slain." Graphic here, especially at this last part. But do note again here, received a command to bless. He is blessed, and I cannot revoke it. That commitment that Yahweh has towards and for his people to accomplish his purposes, to fulfilling the covenant obligations he has set for them in bringing them into a promised land. The very thing that Moses said that, hey, what if the Egyptians hear about what you had failed to accomplish? That God is still committed to making it happen. But also note some of the language here that we have for a king, and how Yahweh's relationship with his people as a king and his subjects, as a father with his children. You have these multiple layers going on. Set within this context, in the rehearsal, the repeating, the reprisal of this common theme about how God is present with his people and has not given them up and given them over, but rather will lead them to conquer and enter into the promised land. There is something to be said here. And again, this is more of an aside or a mortal that he should change his mind. This is more talking about Nahamim. And what I mean by that is that God doesn't repent because of sin in the same way that humans do. Because God does change his mind. We see that more in Genesis 6, where God is grieved, where he's caused grief. We see that with Jonah, where God changes his course of action in relationship to the people's response. He does that with Israel, and when Moses intercedes for them, where God changes his course of action based upon a given circumstance or certain response, and how God is affected by his creature's response. But it's not so much a kind of capricious response as much as it is God defaulting to his mercy. And so that's a little bit of an aside. But what I did want to bring here was that should God repent like a human because of sin? And that's what we need to bring up, because God does change his course of actions based on human response. So I know that sometimes comes up in church, but I did want to address that a little bit because it's here. So that being said, what these four oracles or these poems display is this progression going from these metaphors and images, especially again around the topic of kingship, both human and divine, that will get brought to the forefront, especially as Israel enters into the promised land, where Yahweh is king. Yahweh is king, and that's been the constant throughout the whole of the Pentateuch, throughout the whole of Scripture. And this is a really big point that we bring up in Intro to Biblit. But the thing that gets repeated is God as present with his people as king and leading them into the promised land. And I brought that up before too, where how the camp is set up is as this ancient war camp with the king set up in the middle. And so again, here we get brought to the forefront is this theme of God being king, bringing his people into the promised land to dwell. And so I do want to bring this up and just read this out before we'll close here in a few minutes. But that we have here, there we go, in Numbers 22 to 24, that the important role that it plays in the overall theme of the book, that the death of the old sinful generation of the wilderness and the birth of a new generation of hope on the edge of the promised land, and that through the mouth of a foreign prophet, God blesses Israel with accolades and promises that are unsurpassed in the rest of the Pentateuch. That the oracles, these poems, point to a future time of well-being, of shalom, of wholeness, of strength, and of victory, and of hope. But again, this lofty and exalted vision comes crashing down for the old generation, as in the next chapter, it immediately returns the way of rebellion and disobedience. So again, Israel is caught in between this tension of having these promises, but yet living in the reality of this rebellion. But yet God does not relent from fulfilling these promises of bringing them into the promised land because of these people's rebellion. Instead, he starts over with a new generation. Again, God does not relent from fulfilling his promises, even despite rebellion. But obviously, some accommodations are made in the way that God chooses to go about doing it, especially after these 40 days of negative reports. And so, with the death of the new generation or the old generation, comes the possibility for renewed hope. The possibility that things can be different. The possibility that this new generation will be believing, will be trusting again. And what I mean by that, more so than having all the right information, more so is that they're going to be loyal. They're going to have the demonstration of trust. They're going to be obedient. They're going to trust Yahweh. They're also going to have lots of issues, specifically with idolatry. But that'll be something that we'll talk about and do when we get to Deuteronomy. And especially that'll come up when you guys take Kings and Prophets. And so this last bit of Numbers 26 to 36, that this last section starts off with the second census, which marks the beginning of a new generation. And this generation is portrayed as having a different kind of character, that there's a kind of hope that is imbued after disobedience. And that this new generation then becomes a paradigm for each succeeding generation of God's people afterwards. Of people, despite having seen what they hear and what they, despite having heard what they had heard, seen what they had seen, excuse my English, despite what they had heard, seen what they had seen, I'd still choose to trust Yahweh in what he's committing himself and committing the people to do. They'll still have the same challenges, but they also have with them the same God who was present with their forefathers. And again, they'll have issues with, especially have issues with idolatry. but we will see something a little bit different about this generation. And so as we close out for lecture for today, what I do want to bring up, I don't know if you guys still need to see this, but what I do want to close out with is that these stories do appear elsewhere in the Bible. And again, I know this is an Old Testament class, and our priorities and interests are there, but I think anytime we have a chance to make this land somewhere else in the Bible, that we need to take the opportunity. And so I do want for us to take a look at and read through here in 1 Corinthians 10 some of how Paul is making sense of these stories for himself and for his context. And there's a couple of things that I think we can take away for us today, especially as we're going into Deuteronomy. That Paul in 1 Corinthians 10 writes that I do not want you to be unaware, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea. Again, talking about Exodus. And all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. That they were brought into the people of Israel. They were brought into God's family, God's household. And all ate the same spiritual food and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they all drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. And so we don't have enough time to go into that. But yeah, that's Paul's assertion. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them, and they were struck down in the wilderness. Now these things occurred as examples for us so that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not become idolaters as some of them did, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. You guys know what that's about. We must not indulge in sexual immorality as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. Again, so Paul's picking up that same thing. We must not put Christ to the test as some of them did and were destroyed by serpents. And do not complain as some of them did and were destroyed by the destroyer. Again, this is going like there was some kind of entity that Yahweh allows and controls. These things happened to them to serve as an example, and they are written down to instruct us on whom the ends of the ages have come. So if you think you are standing, watch out that you do not fall. No testing has overtaken you that is not common to everyone. God is faithful, and he will not let you be tested beyond your strength. But with the testing, he will also provide the way out so that you may be able to endure it. So again, the theme of testing comes up again in the wilderness. And again, Paul's suggestion here that God is faithful and will not let you be tested beyond your strength, but with the testing, he will also provide you with the way that you may be able to endure it. And that you have on more than one occasion that these things being written down for us as an example. That we have stories, that these are our spiritual ancestors that include failure and success. And that we ought to learn from both. But that most of the time in church and most of the time, we want to focus on the good parts where the people triumph. We want to focus on the times when Israel did well. We want to focus on the Davids. We want to focus on the kings who conquered. We want to focus on a lot of narratives that give us the things to do. But then what we also need to learn is also those places in which failure was radical. Because we often experience failure. We need to see in which not just what happens as a result of the failure, but also see God's covenant faithfulness and commitment, even despite failure, even despite rebellion. One, to serve as an encouragement, not to give up, even in light of failure. Second, to encourage us towards repentance. And third, so that we'd learn that these things are written that we might learn. And I put the emphasis on might, that our learning from the scriptures, our learning from one another, our learning from these stories is not guaranteed. That just because you know it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. That just because you know better doesn't mean we're going to stay better. That we all have the potential within us to wander and to rebel like Israel does. And that the two things we have in place, one, God's faithfulness and the opportunity for repentance given to us, demonstrated in God's grace in Jesus, as the possibility for making things right between us. But then also, again, there's this example and this reminder not to give up. And that the reality that it's difficult, but yet God is present with the people even through the difficulty. And that Paul doesn't swerve from the no testing is overtaking is not common. God's faithful. He won't let you be tested beyond your strength. That Paul's not saying, yeah, testing only happened because you sin. One, just repent and no testing is going to happen. No. But with the testing, he will also provide. God is faithful so that you may able not to get around it, not to avoid it, not to get through it quicker. He'll provide the way so we can endure it. He'll provide the way so we can endure it. And again, the encouragement for us here that in and through these stories, again, one, the reminder of God's committed faithfulness to his people, even in the midst of wilderness rebellion, and how that affords the possibility for this kind of new beginning that'll happen in Deuteronomy. Again, so all of this is going to set the stage for us for engaging in Deuteronomy next week. But before we do that, are there any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts? Questions? Thoughts? Ironic, because in my version, Balaam says that not even if Balak gives all the silver and gold in his palace, that will make him go beyond God's command. Yeah. Yeah, so he might not make him go beyond it, but it seems like he'll take it. All right. So again, a couple of things for you guys for next week. One of them, your quiz. I do want to remind you guys about it. Again, take your quiz early and often. And the other thing is get your surveys in as soon as possible if you have yet to turn those in. And yeah, if you guys need anything this week, please feel free to let me know. Again, today's class is just going to go a little early. But if you have any questions, I'll be around for a while. So yeah, Johnny, you can stick around if you need anything. But if you guys, no questions, comments, you guys have an absolutely beautiful Monday afternoon. Office hours this week will be regular time, Tuesday, Thursday, 2 to 4. Come through, say hi. Semester's coming to an end, so our time is of the essence together. So see you guys.